Hello, political scientists. It is Wednesday when I'm posting this, and most of you are in school being seen by me, so not sure how helpful this will be. But nevertheless, this video will be here long after you've finished the term's work and have moved on to doing things in the summer. So if you need to come back to it, you absolutely can. We've had a bit of a pause for the equivalent of 4 lessons, and therefore it behooves me to get back on with things and to stop that pause. I left the story at the end of the core ideas and concepts of feminism, which of course means I'm now moving on to the timeline of feminism. Well, I say timeline of feminism, the different kinds of feminism that exist in the world today. Now, the PowerPoint that's attached to the show my homework isn't yet complete. So I'm going to go through part of it today. It will likely take you the 2 lessons to go through, stopping the video, going back, taking notes, making sense of things. Have the textbook handy. It's a good place to start. And there is a task at the end of this that I'm going to ask you to do in order to prefigure what I'm going to talk about with postmodern feminism when we talk about it on Monday next week. So, or Monday's lessons at any rate. So, without further ado, the awful YouTube thing where I look down at the keyboard to work out what I'm doing next, whilst also still talking, because, you know, pause buttons are beyond me apparently. And the green, because feminism. Green is feminism. It just is. Don't question it. Don't write that in an exam. So different types of feminism. The first thing I'm going to do is start with some key terms that will become apparent as we go through and you need to understand before we go any further. The first of these terms is reformists. Reformists, or reformism, is an idea that society can be made to work as it is with incremental and minor changes over time. You can adapt what already exists to make it work. Now, when it comes to feminism, this is talking about gender equality, and gender equality can be achieved gradually and slowly over time based on small changes, incremental changes, slowly building up. So a little bit like conservatism, the idea that all change should be slow so you can work out what works and what doesn't. The second thing I'm going to talk about is equality of opportunity. Now, we've mentioned this already when we were talking about liberalism and the way they approach it. It's very similar for feminists. It just says that the opportunities should be the same regardless of gender. And they do use the term gender rather than sex, so keep that in mind. It's very similar in that regard to liberalism and the idea that everyone should have the ability to do the same things, whether or not they take those opportunities up or can access those opportunities. The third thing is political equality, and that is simply that women should have the rights that men have when it comes to politics, the right to vote, the right to hold political office. And bear in mind, this has not yet been achieved around the world, and although we live in a country where that has been achieved, it is not the same for everybody. And also there's a debate about how far the right to vote and hold political office is actually open to women, even though legally they have those rights. Which brings me to the final point, cultural equality. Which is this idea of gender equality. It means the whole of society. It means how we respond to things. So whilst it's perfectly legal for a woman to hold political office, it's not always possible to do so. If, for example, they have a child, there is something else going on there, and that child, that newborn baby, may prevent them from attending things like, say, Parliament or attending parliamentary votes. And you could argue, therefore, that there is a cultural disparity, whereas men are not expected to look after children in much the same way as women are, and they're not expected to be the primary caregiver. As a consequence, although they both have the legal right to be in Parliament, women have the short end of the stick when it comes to actually exercising that right. Hence, there's a need for cultural equality. The final thing is the idea of legal equality, which I've hinted at already, and this is where you have equal rights within the law and over those same things to do with the law. Sorry, I'm peering over here because my animations have stopped. Okay, so now we've got the basics in play, and now we understand roughly what terminology we're going to be using. I guess what we need to do is move into the different types. We're going to start with liberal feminism, and we start with the reformists of liberal feminists, and in many ways liberal feminists are your first wave. Reformists believe that there was no need for any kind of revolutionary change in the way that things were done. Rather, there needs to be a more organic change to, say, society and the economic sphere. In other words, the public sphere of human life. They argued that in the private sphere, there was less official work that needed to be done. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't believe that that work needed to be done. It just means they didn't think it was the preserve of the political arena to deal with the private area. And you've got to bear in mind that a lot of the women writing at this point had privately quite liberated situations compared to most women. One of the key influences of this, Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, wrote her books and her works, well, in a very different situation to most women. She was widely acknowledged as a self-made woman, widely acknowledged as independent, respected for that, and married reasonably well. Her daughter, by the way, is Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein. So there's a very particular background she's writing from, and that probably explains why the private sphere didn't seem as important to them, because it didn't have to be. They argued, well, here is the argument summarized. Political equality is the basis of all other equality. Women ought, therefore, that should say women, sorry, I was typing quickly, ought therefore to be afforded suffrage, i.e. the right to vote. Once achieved, political emancipation shall form the basis for all future and present equality through legal matters and between men and women. In other words, gender equality will follow on from legal equality because, gender and legal equality will follow on from political equality, because then women would have the ability to alter the course of political action. And that largely was it for a very long time. It fundamentally altered the way women operated. It formed the bedrock of the move towards women's suffrage, and it was pretty much the main form of feminism. You can see why and where this comes from. It makes a lot of sense. Once you have control of the political process, then you can use that political process to affect what you want through voting for people in democracy and through holding office. That's what democracy does, right? Look back to your early notes on democracy. It absolutely is what it's supposed to do. The second wave kicks in with Betty Friedan, and we're back to that image. I couldn't find a better one. And her book, couldn't find a better one. And she kickstarts the second wave of feminism, you could argue. And she was writing in 1963, and it was based on a series of questionnaires carried out with people that she went to university with and their responses. And she wrote this book, and in it, the first chapter is called The Problem That Has No Name. And there's a sentence from it, it's in the textbook, but I've recreated it here, hopefully easier to read. It said, the problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. Interesting, I'm not sure Radfem would agree. The American is an interesting one. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction. The question that each woman struggles with, is this all? Basically, women were beginning to realize that perhaps political emancipation had not brought the legal and gender equality that they had thought it would. It had not translated in the same way. Or things that looked like they were equal, perhaps weren't. The way the workplaces worked, the way that childbearing was split up, the way that women were treated. These things seemingly hadn't changed as much as people thought they might do in those early years of liberal feminism. So Friedan argued there needed to be a greater focus and a greater move towards it. So she argued basically for women in politics to push for a little bit more, to bring other things under the microscope of feminist thought, rather than just pure political engagement. Simone de Beauvoir had also come from this background. She argued that women had been forced to be the other in many ways. Oh, I've broken my animations, I do apologize. And that there needs to be a recognition that women have been othered, i.e. not made the same as men, that they were seen as second-class citizens. I'm just going to pause this a moment because I think I've broken my animations. Hold on. I've got a nasty suspicion. Oops, that's all been recorded. Never mind, you've seen me playing around with my animations and make sure they work. Guess now you know they're going to work. So, de Beauvoir argued for the recognition that women have been othered, and liberal feminists therefore campaigned to change three things. They wanted an end to discrimination and inequality at work. They opposed outdated cultural attitudes about women and where they should be, and sexist language, and they wanted to do this through education, a very liberal way of doing this, but actually quite socialist. The idea that education can change your environment, can change the way you think about things, is actually quite a socialist move. But it's also a liberal idea that you teach people reason and the goodwill out in the marketplace of ideas that education represents. And ultimately, they argued that you could bring about a change in law. And sure enough, it achieves that. Here is a chart of all the changes in law that were brought about by liberal feminism. You've got the Married Women's Property Act in 1870. Before that point, women were not allowed to own property. It was the property of their father or the property of their husband. And that is astonishing that it took that long. Mary Wollstonecraft was very against that. Now, interestingly, she was allowed to have property, but it was assumed it was her husband's. The first sitting MP in 1919 is Nancy Astor in the House of Commons. Now, Nancy Astor is known for many things, not usually as a feminist or the first female MP. She's usually known for her anti-Semitic views. She argued that Hitler was the greatest thing that had ever happened to the Jewish problem of the world. And she further argued that black people ought to be grateful for slavery. But she was the first sitting MP and was proof, I guess, in terms of feminism, that women can be bastards too. Representation of the People Act in 1928. Women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote regardless of whether or not they held property. That, I guess, was similar to men and therefore was a giant leap forward. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 said that it's illegal for women to have the same work as a man, but be paid less. I mean, there is a way around that, of course. What you do is you change the role if you give it to a man, and therefore you can pay him more. This is still carried out. So when people say there's no real wage inequality, what they mean is for the same work, people are paid the same, and that much is verifiably true. But what tends to happen is when a woman's role is given to a man, that role changes and the man tends to be paid more. That tends to be how it works. You don't have to make significant changes, just has to be a couple of semantic ones. So you can say it's not the same work and it's not the same job. So although it is a great leap forward, already you're beginning to realize that each of these come with downsides. The Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 said it was illegal to discriminate against women in work, education, or training, which kind of implies that it was beforehand, despite the Equal Pay Act and everything else that had gone on. So there's that. The first female prime minister, of course, was Margaret Thatcher, which the textbook tells us is a demonstration of gender equality. I go back to Nancy Astor and just leave it there, really. Nancy Astor's got a statue. It was unveiled in 2019 during the election campaign. Funny how that works, really, isn't it? The Sex Discrimination Amendment Act of 1986 prevented discrimination against women in selection, promotion, vocational training, and working conditions. Note those phrases. Working conditions is a fun one. So women actually have a higher core temperature than men. It means that you're less likely to experience things such as organ failure due to, what's it called? Heat changes. There's a word for it. It's gone from my brain. I do apologize. No, it's totally gone. But the drawback of that is that you feel the cold more. So workplace temperatures, for example, tend to be set for men rather than women. And that, you could argue, is a form of discrimination. So there's forms of discrimination that are clearly being rounded out in 1986. The second thing is it's illegal to dismiss a woman who had reached pensionable age where the age is different between men and women. So you can't just dismiss a woman in a job that a man would hold until 65 because she's 60. Though those ages are changing now and women are being brought more into line with men. So make of that what you will. These are changes in law that you could argue are all, well, I say argue, they are all positive. Whether or not they're entirely positive is another thing beside that. And liberal feminism of this type has been criticized by radical feminism and by third wave postmodern feminists because it focuses mainly on the white women and middle class definition of feminism. It's been argued, for example, that liberation to work is useless when black women, for example, and working class women, for example, were already in work all this time. So it's not necessarily liberation to work for them. Nevertheless, makes the point. The next form of feminism we're going to talk about is socialist feminism. And perhaps I should have done this in a green and a red, but I'm not sure what that is. Make a brown. It's hard to study socialist feminism, not least because it's a form of socialism, and therefore does it really belong there, but also because it's a broad church. There are many different branches of socialist feminism, all of which are different, all of which disagree, and all of which have slightly different approaches. So the best I can do is offer you two generalizations and two general approaches to feminism. Now, I could go through them all in turn. I'm not going to this time, a bit like I did with liberalism. I could do it like that, but I've decided not to because, well, we're getting close to the end of the year. And the less complexity, really, honestly, the better. So here we go. The first form is reformist feminism. And this is best summarized by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who we've met before, writer of the Yellow Wallpaper. If you haven't, please read that short story. It's worth a read. She argued, from an essentialist perspective, that women were more socialist in outlook and character. They were more given to collectivism and cooperation. These were feminine qualities in society. And she argued that any kind of revolution or evolution toward socialism would succeed in removing capitalism, and in so doing, removing a prop that held up the exploitative qualities of patriarchy. Patriarchy would be removed in favor of women and men coexisting in an egalitarian society and economy. As a consequence, she saw herself more as a humanist and a people person rather than a feminist. Now, it's worth pointing out that by today's standards, what she espoused is definitely feminism and does not come under humanism. But she called herself that, so we've got to respect her wishes on that one. People have often said, oh, feminism itself is a sexist term. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would have disagreed with you. She simply argued that she was about more than simple gender equality. She further argued that sex and the capitalist economy were linked. And one of her most famous statements was about marriage and prostitution. She said, the transient trade, we think evil. The bargain for life, we think good. She was basically saying that capitalism allows people to buy and sell certain commodities like sex, which are given freely elsewhere. And therefore, she argued, what exactly is the difference? It's still a service that women provide for men, whether or not men pay for it. One could argue that prostitution was better than marriage in her argument, simply because women got paid for the work that they did, in a way that they don't in marriage. And she argued this can be applied across capitalism. And we'll talk about this more in a moment, but the idea that women were carrying out work for free without getting paid for it, and therefore their work was less valued, even though it was more vital. So she's kind of prefiguring a lot of later debates and ideas to do with feminism. Indeed, one of the things she comes up with is that economic independence will give women freedom and equality. Motherhood shouldn't prevent women from working outside the home. Therefore, she argued, without using these words, the personal is political, and that women were held back by the private sphere as much as they were held back by barriers put in their way in the public sphere. She also championed the idea of communal living, where women could work together with helping one another with child rearing and housework, and that these things could be professionalized. That is, you could train to do those things, get better at them, and be paid for those functions. A place where you could pay other people to look after your children, and they would be trained in that, so that people didn't go into child rearing and looking after their children without any idea what they were doing. Imagine if we had such a system today, where parents weren't expected to look after their children from birth, but could pay for others to do so who were professionally trained and had up-to-the-minute research and had had previous experience. Can you imagine that society? People might say, oh, I don't like it. It takes people away from their families. But then you consider some people need to be anyway. So all this does is make childhood better. Interesting. Gilman's ideas are often referred back to by later feminists, and you'll find her cropping up in radical feminism and other kinds of feminism as well, because, well, she was the first person to put these ideas down on paper. You can find, by the way, a key thinker box on page 347 of the textbook, well worth a read. I very deliberately didn't use the same image, by the way. Next one is the revolutionary form of socialist feminism. And this comes from Friedrich Engels, one of the first people to articulate what it was that socialism was. And he recognized that capitalism altered pre-existing societal structures. So previously, men and women were broadly equal. Capitalism meant that women were needed to be unpaid helpers in the home so that men could go out to work in the capitalist system. Furthermore, in times of stress or difficulty, women were a reserve army of labor who could be drafted in to plug gaps for short term and then sent back. Now, keep in mind, Engels is writing before the First World War, where that actually occurs. So he prefigures this and saw the embryonic way that that would take place. The reserve army of labour is an idea that women constitute a spare workforce, and getting them out of the workplace was important so that capitalism could exploit men more effectively and also use the women to make sure men could put in more hours. Whereas if you employed them both, that wouldn't work. Now, from this, we have Sheila Robotham, who we've met before, and she wrote a book, Hidden from History, in 1973. The picture I've got here is from 1969. And in that book, she expanded on Engels's theories and augmented them with a female perspective. She found that working class women found employment in factories, and they tended to be paid less than men. They were often given no childcare provision, and they were treated and worked like cattle, both at home and at work, where people basically just herded them around. Now, there is an element of this. Mia Mies, looking at global feminism, found that women tend to be employed by transnational corporations and large companies in other countries because they're seen to be more pliable, easily cowed, and able to be paid less than their male counterparts. So multinational companies will often employ women in poor countries for precisely the reasons that Sheila Robotham wrote about in 1973. And that carries on today. She further argued that men couldn't be relied upon to be upstanding allies or to carry out changes themselves. You needed a woman's perspective because men, she argued, don't understand the oppression that women are under. Her quote is, "Men will often admit that other women are oppressed, but not you, never you." And there's something to that. When we have discussions in classes, when I've had discussions about feminism in the past, it tends to be that men will agree that women are oppressed, and men will agree that oppression exists, and that even patriarchy exists to some degree. But when women in the class raise their own oppressions, you can see the male students begin to turn off because they don't believe that anybody they know could be oppressed. And I find that fascinating. It's not a problem. It's not like men deliberately do this, but it's a fascinating perspective. It's very difficult to put ourselves in other people's shoes. Now, I recognize I am a man talking about feminism and talking about oppression within feminism through the perspective of a man, at least as far as you know. I do have the beard, though, to prove it. She therefore argued, did Sheila Robotham, that there needed to be a revolution within a revolution. First of all, you need a revolution to get rid of capitalism, and within that revolution, you needed a second one to remove the gender inequalities that came part and parcel of what it was to be, well, a woman, I suppose. Sometimes it's hard to be a woman. Is that Dolly Parton? I think that's Dolly Parton. Anyway, I'm moving on. De Beauvoir, I've mentioned her before, Simone, believed that part of the problem was consumptive materialism. Now, consumptive materialism, a term that means that society is essentially addicted to spending money to buy stuff. The famous anarchist philosopher, Papa Roach, yeah, I know, it's a joke, don't worry about it, that's not real, had that song, "There's no money, there's no possessions, only obsessions, he don't need that." And there's another word there. You can look it up yourself. I forget what the song's called. It's Papa Roach, though. Basically, de Beauvoir was taking from Beauvoir was taking the ideas from anarchism. The addiction to consumer goods and money weakens humans. In particular, it weakens women's position within society because women have to buy more stuff. Consider clothing in the modern era as an illustration. Women have to layer. I've checked out women's clothing. I have a wife, and she occasionally asks me to buy things. So I have to check these things out. They are thinner than men's. And therefore, if you want to be warm, I assume you must have to wear more layers. I can get away with a shirt and a jacket, whereas a woman has to rely on at least 2 more layers than that in order to feel, well, protected from the cold. And you can see that in school uniforms as well. Were we in a classroom, I could point this out. And that, I find, is fascinating. Just that bit alone. Women have to spend more on clothing than men do because of its nature. And because it's thinner, it doesn't last as long. So women spend more on clothing more often than men. That is fascinating. And you could argue that's an element of consumptive materialism that holds women back because they have to buy more stuff, basically. They can't use their money for other things. The second thing to talk about is Mitchell. Juliet Mitchell, we've not met her before, argued that the destruction of capitalism might not be enough. That she said patriarchy is ingrained, even amongst those who would overthrow capitalism. Now, this anecdote is not hers. It comes from someone else, and I couldn't find out who in the time I had available to make this, so I'll have to come back to it later. But there's an example from the Soviet Union, which is summed up best by the Soviet Union believed women could fly to the moon just as much as men could, as long as they did the washing and ironing when they got back, which I think sums up the Soviet Union's approach to feminism. And, argued Mitchell, pretty much every man's approach to feminism. She said that there therefore needed to be other forms of liberation. There were 4 social functions that women must be liberated from. The first of these was being part of the workforce and production, and what their role was within that. The second of these was childbearing and birth, because that is debilitative and can lead to death. The largest cause of death in the world for women aged 15 to 34 is childbirth. Take a moment to think on that. Thirdly, the socialization and child-rearing roles of women take up an incredibly large amount of time, and women need to be liberated from that. And she's not saying they don't have to do it at all. She's saying they need to be liberated from the expectation that the role is theirs. And finally, she argued there's a liberation required from the societal position of women as sex objects. And into this, I'm going to inject a fairly modern debate, the debate on nipples on social media. Forgive me. Men have nipples, and as far as I can tell, male nipples have literally no point. They are useless. They do nothing. They are vestigial. They have no use. And yet, no one cares if a man flaunts a nipple online, where, given that it has no function, there can be no reason to flaunt that nipple apart from sexualization to show off his body. Women, on the other hand, have nipples that actually have a point. They can be used in child rearing. They can be used in childcare. They have a biological function. And yet, if you were to post an image of a woman breastfeeding on social media, it could be taken down as breaking that, Facebook in particular, breaking their code in showing the female nipple, because the female nipple is apparently pornographic and sexualized and should not be available to the eyes of small children. Just think about that for a moment. Because it's sexualized, it shouldn't be given to the eyes of small children who we also expect to breastfeed. So they can't see a nipple except in real life where they have it thrust in their face because it's sexualized. Does that mean breastfeeding children are engaged in a sexual act? So there are some inconsistencies, and therefore, because of these inconsistencies, we can see that this is not necessarily an organic, natural way of organizing society. Mitchell's got a point. Women are seen as sex objects, and we've actively encouraged society to make that so. Indeed, there's very little women can do where they're not accused of using their bodies as sex objects. For men, only for men, not for the women themselves. And that I find fascinating. And again, I recognize the inconsistency and difficulty in being a man talking about these issues from the point of view of a man. But nevertheless, I hope the point is made. Basically, what Mitchell did, and builds on the work of Robertson and de Beauvoir, was to link the economic sphere with the cultural sphere and argue that socialism had a role to play in both, and that feminism, therefore, could bring these things together, that women had to be liberated in both ways in order to, well, be fully liberated. So that is the join together. You can see that there are multiple points of view here. I've simplified significantly, but this is just an A-level. You're not studying this at university yet. The next one is my favourite. It's RadFem. Hooray! I like RadFem. It's very challenging. It was set up mainly to rebut the second wave of feminism from the liberals' perspective. Specifically, the liberal feminist perspective was being rebutted by radical feminists. Their slogan was "the personal is political," and obviously, therefore, they refer back to Gilman, who was the first to put that into different words. And their argument is varied. There's no one radical feminism. And we've touched on this already when I was talking about core values. There is an argument within radical feminism between those who would exclude trans women and those who would not. And that's interesting. There's at least two forms of radical feminism, but there are more too. And one of the big deals about radical feminism is that the more they drilled down to discover what it is that needed to change, they found significantly different answers. And then they found significantly different debates about how far you could actually argue on behalf of others whose experiences you did not know. This is called identity politics. It's not what you've heard about in the news. So, oftentimes, online and in the news and in culture, when you hear the term identity politics, it's mainly being bandied around by some right-wing or alt-right person to argue against or to argue for the fatuity of trying to organize things by different groups, saying that it's identity politics to put one group above another, and therefore you can't really have any kind of consensus reached. Even the textbook seems to hint that way, which I find fascinating, but then I remember that it was originally based on work carried out by Neil MacNaughton before he died, and he's a very interesting character too. Identity politics, what it actually means, is that it's difficult to argue a point of view and an experience which you have not actually had. I am engaging in what identity politics would find very, very difficult. I am trying to present to you the female perspective of feminism in radical feminism. And radical feminism would have a significant problem with me doing that because I am not a female. I mean, I've got a beard. It's kind of a giveaway. And the argument would therefore go that whilst I can parrot the words like a dog that can stand on two legs and has learned how to talk, I can't understand the experience. And therefore, it's difficult for me to be emphatic about things. Now, radical feminism therefore argues that that doesn't have to be a gender-based thing. It can be a race-based thing. White women, can they really talk about the experiences of black women? And it stemmed from the 1980s and 1990s when very well-meaning feminists went abroad, talked to people in places like India, took down their experiences, and then tried to write about what needed to be done for those women in India or Africa or South America. And the argument came back, well, who allowed you to speak for them? Why can't they speak for themselves? Surely the role is to allow them to speak for themselves. But then that gets even more problematic. Should white middle-class women, able to travel with the money and ability to do so, tell other women around the world what their goals should be? What role do you play in that? And this is identity politics. Many radical feminists dislike identity politics because it destroyed the movement of radical feminism in the 1970s and 1980s, fractured it into a million pieces, and it's never really got back together again. Now, modern postmodern feminism allows those shards to come back in intersectionality and solidarity rather than sisterhood, but radical feminism is very keen on the idea of sisterhood and purely female action because of identity politics previously mentioned to do with gender. So when I mention identity politics, know that's how I'm using it and why I'm talking about it. And know also that it leads to problems for radical feminism. Radical feminism has to deal with that somehow. And this explains why it's such a fractured movement and why it's very hard to say this is what radical feminists believe, because oftentimes there isn't such a thing as radical feminism. So there's no single version of RadFem is my point. Whoops, and my Fizzog is back. Thank you. So into this comes Kate Millett. Now, we've met Kate Millett already when I was talking about the core values and principles. Here is another image of her, this time not next to a bunch of toilets that she's made. This is an image from her last interview. And she took a psychoanalytical approach to understanding feminism and to understanding the female condition. And she was critical of romantic love. She argued that romantic love is often created, it's often taught, and it's often learned rather than intrinsic and organic. And she's got a point. Organic love is often taught, romantic love is often taught to children. Well, we kind of teach it to children, don't we? If a girl and a boy are friends, we make light of the fact that they must be boyfriend and girlfriend. We start talking about kissing or holding hands in front of them to the people, or even we make them do it. And largely for the amusement of adults, to be fair, or the amusement of people who are slightly older because they want to embarrass someone younger. And we create that embarrassment, and we imply that any kind of interaction between men and women, any kind of heterosexual interaction at all, is to do with relationship building and romantic love. And romantic love in and of itself is also a construct. In the Middle Ages, it was a construct of poetry. It wasn't anticipated that anybody lived out those romantic love ideals, the giving of flowers, the holding of doors, the giving of compliments, the courtship ritual of the male. All of this is constructed. It's not actually an organic thing. It's not a human thing at all. And its end result, marriage, can in many ways be seen, certainly monogamous marriage, as a form of ownership and a form of control to stop the woman sleeping with other men, to stop the woman leaving, to trap the woman in domestic drudgery, while the male can continue to do what he likes. After all, the woman takes the male's name, and the woman tends to take control of the household. It is expected. And those who do sociology can prove it with stats. So this isn't just a political ideology, it is provable. So Miller argued that patriarchy comes through romantic love, where it's assumed that women are always vying for the attention of a male and must wait for the male to bestow their attention upon the female before the female can act upon it. And marriage, where women are owned by men. Furthermore, once you create a monogamous marriage, you've created the family unit, and that family unit socializes its children in that milieu. It creates the patriarchy and teaches the children how the patriarchy works, just by dint of being a family. There are boy jobs and girl jobs. Thank you, Theresa May. So there's that. And these norms of behavior are enforced, encouraged, maintained, and increased by everything else in society, from religion to education to the roles of myths, art, and literature. It's very hard to escape them. Watch any film with a sparky female lead, and you will discover that actually the roles that women can play are significantly smaller than you think. The last major feminist work made in film was actually Mad Max Fury Road. I know, imagine that. And the one before that was, oh flip, it's gone. Oh, two women take a road trip, and the only male roles are either as the enemy or as people literally phoning in their role. What's it called? Not Diamond and Greg. That was a TV show. Darn it, I can't remember. Oh, flip. And that in itself says something, doesn't it? This is why men can't really explain feminism. But my point being, if you, a good example would be the film, hang on. Often held up as a feminist film and a feminist trope is Frozen. But interestingly, in the animation shorts, if you ever watch that film, there's sort of an extra on the DVD or the Blu-ray. And if you go to the extras, when they talk about how they were making animations, you'll discover a conversation between the animators on how to differentiate between the two sisters. And they said they had to have different clothing throughout the film because one of the problems they had was it was impossible to tell the difference between the female characters otherwise. And that led me to have an interesting thought. They never said the same about the male characters within the film. And if you watch the film, you'll notice the male characters look very different. And if you look carefully, you will find that Elsa and Anna, I mean, seriously, actually have the same basic animation model. Now, why is that? They're supposed to be different. Sure, they're supposed to have familial resemblance, but they're supposed to be different people with widely different personalities. And yet it was decided on an animation level that the only way to differentiate between the two was to give them different clothing. That tells you something, I think, about how women are viewed in society and where their roles lie and how people accept it. Maybe Miller's got a point. Oh, flip. Oh, my face is still there. There's also, therefore, that's art, by the way, in case you're wondering what I was talking about. There's also, therefore, the creation of a false consciousness. And that was that women believe their role is to be romanced, to get married, to be loved, to have children, to be loved by a man, and to be a mother, essentially, or some variation on that. If you've ever said, ladies, to anyone that you don't want children, you know what the answer is. People will say things like, oh, you're too young to make that decision now. Not too young to go to university and choose university, or to choose your life partner and marry them, or to not choose your life partner, or even to have sex. But you're too young to make a decision about whether or not you want children. Or you'll change your mind is another fun one. When the biological clock starts ticking, as if your only purpose on this earth is to reproduce. They never say the same to men. When a man says, I don't want children, people sort of go, oh yeah, fair enough. And no one ever says to a man, oh, when your biological clock starts ticking. It's a fascinating thing. Anyway, that, said Millett, was a false consciousness. And the way to deal with that would be to abolish the nuclear family and replace it with a communal living lifestyle where you can share child rearing duties and live together. In essence, she's got, hang on, why is that not working? There we go. In essence, she goes back to what Gilman was talking about in Socialist Feminism. However, I did say it was a fractured ideology, and I've explained why. And that depends on your interpretations of what patriarchy actually is. So here are some examples, which I've drawn from the textbook, I'll be honest, to show the different versions of patriarchy that radical feminism tries to deal with, and the proposed solutions, and the name of the feminist who tried to come up with those solutions. So the first example of patriarchy is domestic violence. It's far too prevalent, there's far too much of it for it to be bad eggs or individuals with problems. It is part and parcel of our society. And again, if you're a sociologist, you've got facts to back that up. Don't worry, we're politicians, we're political scientists. All we need to know is it is. So don't worry about that. You never have to explain it. How do you deal with the problem of domestic violence? Well, the first way was Erin Pizzey, who set up the first women's refuge in London in 1971, specifically to be a women-only space with children, to allow women and their children to escape from and feel safe from domestic violence, a place where they could live communally, a place where they could share experiences, and a place where they would be safe because there would be no men around. So there would be no lingering fear. Because if it is systematic and throughout society, all men benefit from domestic violence, even if they themselves are not domestic abusers. Because the fear from the woman is always going to be the same. She doesn't know whether or not a man is a domestic abuser or not. Or put another way, and this I can share from a male perspective, so bear with me here. To put it another way, if you're walking on the same route home as a woman late at night, gentlemen, and that woman quickens her pace, whose responsibility is it to allay the fears of that woman that you might be a rapist? Well, you could be a racist too, I suppose, but that's less relevant to this. You might be a rapist. Now, gentlemen, I'm not suggesting for a moment that any of you are rapists or that you would carry out rape. That would be ridiculous. However, does the woman know that? What do? Do you speed up and say, don't worry, I'm not a rapist, allow me to explain the reasons why? That's just creepy and weird. Or do you accept that there are enough people who would rape a woman and that society has taught that woman to be fearful of rapists, such as the person you now appear to be, that the only thing really to do is to change your route and to experience a little bit of discomfort so that woman feels safer? Or are some of you now screaming at me, well, how dare you, sir? Why should I have to change my behaviour? I'm not a rapist, and maybe the woman shouldn't think of herself as a victim. Well, I'll say to you, it's coming, don't worry, I will explain. Also, there's that thing about getting on a bus. I think I've mentioned it before in sociology, but I discovered this recently, fairly recently, within the last couple of years, and I was shocked by it. And it's true. When you get on a bus, gentlemen, do you actually give any thought about where you're going to sit on that bus beyond, is there a spare seat? I don't. I mean, I look for a double spare seat because I'm me and I don't like other people being too close, unless they're my family. Even then I have problems. But the point is, I tend to look for a space and I sit down. Women don't do that. They will analyze the entire bus and see where they feel safest. And there are certain seats they will never sit on because of who's around them and nearby. They undertake an entire threat analysis of that bus before they sit down in a way that men simply don't. And that is fascinating and tells you something about the imbalance in gender on how we perceive the world around us. Coming back to this idea of domestic violence and how it works. How do all men benefit? Sorry, I've said that. I didn't actually explain it. Because women don't know that you're not a domestic abuser. So they've got to work hard to make sure that you are not turned into one, if that makes sense. And you benefit from that because women are more fearful around you, even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. Ladies, you're probably screaming at the screen right now that you don't do that either. And that's fair enough. The next one is heterosexual relationships. And this is Charlotte Bunch, who argued that heterosexual relationships are a power transaction, that men and women transact their power between one another in a heterosexual relationship. The easiest way of describing this is missionary position. My apologies, it comes down to sex. And it's usually assumed that the man is on top. A woman on top is considered a kink or a bit weird when it comes to sex. Or, oh, she's got a lot of confidence, rather than just sex. Whereas man on top is normal. And that heteronormative view that men should take a leading role in a relationship shows that the heterosexual relationships, generally speaking, are a power transaction. And therefore, argued Charlotte Bunch, lesbianism should be a political choice, not just a sexual one. So women could choose to be lesbians for political reasons. Now, there is research backing this up, that women tend to view women as more romantic partners than they do men. So when I had, when we talk about the genderbread person, version 3.3, I believe, do look it up online. If I remember, I'll put it in the description of this task. And you can see that there's various different types. You've got romantic love and sexual love and attraction. And those are very different things. Women often hug women in ways that men don't hug other men. Men tend to view their romantic attachment as similar to, or not exactly the same, as their sexual attraction. So homosexual men will view men romantically and sexually. Heterosexual men will view women romantically and sexually. But no man will view other men romantically, i.e. as someone you can go to for comfort and support, whereas women tend to view other women romantically. So, coming back to this, the political choice could be that you don't want to have sex as a lesbian, but at the same time, you recognize there's a safety in a lesbian relationship, and as a consequence, you can have political lesbianism. So it's not sexual lesbianism necessarily, but a recognition that you are safer as a woman in that kind of relationship. And this brings us on to pornography, because everything brings us back to pornography eventually, I'm sorry. Pornography, Andrea Dworkin, you've met her already, argued that it's symptomatic of men's perception of women as sex objects. Now, I'm not suggesting you go and look at porn, just don't. It's appalling. The little snippets that I've seen in my life have convinced me that I have no need of pornography. And there's a lot of women as sex objects. I've seen some evidence that women, well, actually, I don't need to do this. I can do the studies. The studies show that women are often shown from the chin down when it comes to pornography. Their faces are rarely there unless they're engaged in a sexual act with their face. And female ejaculation, female climaxing, my apologies, I'm using the scientific terms, are actually illegal to be shown. So on pornography, you'll rarely, if ever, find a woman who's genuinely enjoying herself because it's illegal to show that. You will find plenty of male gratification because that's not illegal to show. Make of that what you will. Therefore, argued Dworkin, because pornography is used in a very particular way, and because it's mainly male-dominated and for the male gaze, you should, first of all, have female pornography that isn't exploitative. And there is such a thing. There is such a thing as feminist pornography. I have never encountered it, but it's out there. And apparently it's a very different experience. I wouldn't know. But again, maybe don't go looking into it, but it does exist. But as it supports the nuclear family, and building on what Charlotte Bunch was saying with heterosexual relationships, she argued that the nuclear family as a whole should be abolished. So even a lesbian nuclear family isn't good enough. And maybe there should be lesbian communities where women live together and, well, look after one another in all ways, including sexually. That doesn't mean they're having a sexual relationship. It just means that sexuality is part of the human experience. And remember, the personal is political. Speaking of sexual needs and wars, Germaine Greer, yes, the interview that I asked you to watch, argued that women were socialized to view sexual desire, any kind of sexual desire, as unfeminine, and their own sexual desires in particular as being a betrayal of their femaleness, and be embarrassed about their bodies. And that I think we can back up on. I think women generally are taught to be embarrassed about their bodies. They cover up at a younger age than boys. They've got to cover up more of their bodies than boys. Why do 5-year-old girls, for example, need to hide their breasts? They don't have any, they're 5. Now, I'm not suggesting that they should be on show either. That would be really difficult coming from a beardy man who's also a teacher. But the point is made that it's weird that we don't do the same for, well, boy children. I mean, perhaps we should. Equally, women are told to retain eternal youth, to look after their bodies and to always look young and spry, rather than embracing age and experience, the silver fox that men are often called. I say men are often called, some men. I will never be called a silver fox, not least because I'm not silver, and also because I don't think I could ever have that thing. Also, therefore, she says, what you need to do is abandon traditional marriage. Traditional marriage doesn't work. You need a form of sexual liberation, where women can be free to enjoy their sexual ideas and who they are as a sexual being, and combat male domination of relationships through communal living and child rearing. So going back to the idea of lesbian communities and political lesbianism that Germaine Greer didn't talk about, didn't start, but did talk about in The Female Eunuch. She's similar to Millett, but she is herself, that is Greer, not Millett, a more heterosexual voice on this. So that a heterosexual female who embraces her heterosexuality talks about political lesbianism, lends it weight in a way that Millett, talking about political lesbianism being a lesbian, perhaps doesn't. But by the same token, the fact they both mention it is important. The last point is an example of patriarchy where it is believed that women are enslaved by men. So we come to Shulamith Firestone, who adopted the work of Marx and Engels and their idea of dialectical materialism to explain how it was that women had come to be second-class citizens within society. Sorry, I'm just spotting people moving around. And she said that they said female enslavement happened later. Engels, remember, said that capitalism had created the situation where women were a reserve army of labor. And she argued, well, that's not necessarily true. Rather, women have always been enslaved by men. It comes from men's larger muscle mass and the realization that a man can punch a problem and the problem stops being a problem. And women, therefore, have had to deal with that throughout history. To fix that, the gender struggle is also dialectic. Women are an exploited class by the other exploiting class, the ruling class of the male. Therefore, as in dialectics, I think I've talked about this before, in dialectics, as you have a thesis, an idea that creates its own antithesis, anti-idea, and they form a conflict, and the conflict creates a new synthesis. The masculine and the feminine would come into conflict and create a synthesis that would be both or neither. Now, the textbook actually gets confusing on this point. It says it's the combination of neither, but then explains how it has elements of both. The word the textbook uses is androgyny, and that's the word that Firestone uses too. That is not neither masculine nor feminine. It is in fact both, having both androgyne features and gingen? Oh, I've got myself confused here. But it has both masculine and feminine features, androgen. It has both, androgynous. And she argued for an androgynous society where it will be embraced, where people showed elements of both masculinity and femininity. She argued that childbirth in its current form was barbaric and that science could rescue women from the barbarism of our current approaches to reproduction. Sex should be about pleasure, not about reproduction. Therefore, artificial insemination was the future. Furthermore, there could be a point where science would achieve the ability to have men giving birth, or, she argued further, that men would no longer be required, that you could actually inseminate an egg with another egg, and therefore there would be no need for the male part of the human species. Now, she was arguing this not because she hated men. There's no man hatred here. She was arguing from a perspective of ending the barbarism that comes part and parcel of childbirth. Remember, the largest cause of death for females aged 15 to 44. And she was arguing, therefore, for a gender equal approach to childbirth. She wasn't saying all men should be exterminated. She was saying science might reach a point where men were no longer required, or where men could be implanted with wombs and then give birth, so that you would have full gender equality. Now, whatever you believe about radical feminism, that's what they say. So there we go. That's fun. I think so anyway, and highly challenging, whether or not you agree with it. And thus, post-feminism, which is where I'm going to sort of end this particular session. In the 1980s and early 1990s, it was a movement that was growing from former feminists and people who had never been feminist. And they argued that feminist goals had largely been achieved within the UK and the US, and therefore the world, by the 1980s and early 1990s. And really, feminists ought to just, get over it, move on. Things have been done now. All of the goals that they set out to achieve were achieved. There was no longer any need, they argued, for feminism. And it was a very powerful and persuasive argument. And its vestiges still exist in today's society. One of the key ones of these is Camille Paglia, who argued that feminism portrayed women as victims, and that created the very situation feminism said it was trying to combat. And she argued women were not victims. I'll put it in her words. Feminism portrays women as victims. They are not. Women must take responsibility for their own life choices and sexual conduct. Don't like it? Choose better. And basically, this argued that if women were in abusive relationships, well, that was kind of their own fault. They should have chosen better. Not that the men should escape blame, but the woman had to take responsibility for her actions. To blame society for her situation would be incorrect. And feminism was therefore going too far. And that feminism had probably gone far enough. And that men were now feeling under threat. And that women were saying this means it comes under different types of feminism. The critique of this is that the whole point of post-feminism examines feminism exclusively through the lens of being white, middle class, and in a developed country. It ignores the complexities of female experience that radical feminism was attempting to deal with, but struggled with and ended up being fractured by. And thus, we enter a realm of postmodern feminism. And that is where I'm going to pick up next week. Before I finish the video though, part of what I want you to do is to look up some things on the internet, not the things I've mentioned so far, to look up some things on the internet to do with postmodern feminism, to offer a grounding. I'd like you to look up what the furore, for want of a better phrase, is, for want of a better phrase, the furore over Gamergate. Look it up online, have a see. And that, I guess, will form the basis of my opening discussion to do with postmodern feminism. In particular, in case you're wondering, on the textbook, it's on page 351. It calls it cyber patriarchy because it's written by people who obviously weren't growing up at the same time as the internet, so the word cyber sounds cool. I'm talking about activity on the internet and social media, and Gamergate is fascinating because it prefigures a lot of the examples that the textbook use. And I caught it while it was happening and the feminist response to it. So it is a fascinating thing to look up. It won't take you long. You should be able to find the controversy relatively quickly, and you'll be amazed to know that it turned into a culture war, or perhaps you won't, and who was involved. So we're going to look at that next time. There was something I was going to put in the description. Hopefully I'll be able to watch the video back and remember before I put the description online, and I'm hoping that this session has made sense. It's gone a bit long, so I do apologize. It will take you 2 lessons to do this. I hope you've had a break in the middle of it. I hope you had some cake. You deserve it for listening to this. And yeah, if you have been, thank you very much for watching. And I shall be back for one of the final videos, I suppose. I said we'd do nationalism, but people are so far behind now. And I'm not surprised. It's getting to that end of the year. We probably won't do nationalism, and that's okay. We're back on Monday to finish off feminism. And then on Wednesday next week, I'll set the last bit of assessment, the last bit of practice. And then I guess we're done. Well, I'll put some things up for last week, and we'll see how we go. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day. Stay safe out there. And I'll see you on Monday.